Welcome back everyone to another video. This one is going to be a little bit of a different video. In fact, it's going to be a two-part mini-series where I'm going to have a look at a deck with you with some depth to it rather than just play the deck. The deck we're looking at here is a mixture out of two different ideas, one being around the Blob of Tar and Ravenous Hunter, and the other one being around the Cliff Dive. In this first part of the mini-series, we're just gonna have a look at what's in the deck, why it's in the deck, and then have a look at the mulligan. And in the second part, we're gonna look at some gameplay then and some decisions to be made during the games after the mulligan. So this deck is a hybrid, as I mentioned, between two different ideas. And it has two main packages. The first one being the Blob of Tar, Ravenous Hunter. So the idea is that you get the Blob of Tar out. This has Taunt and it has Poisonous. So it can both block your opponent's minions, like from hitting you, and it can also deal with big minions from your opponent. And then the Ravenous Hunter resummons them multiple times. And you can get quite a few of these in total then to deal with whatever minions your opponent might play. So this is basically the idea of setting up a wall where your opponent can't really get through, and at the same time have some chip damage you can get in, because they're quite difficult to clear as well. And you can get past through your opponent's minions with the Poisonous. There's two more cards with this package, one being the Tuskpiercer. The idea is here just to have like another card which can get you there, just war the minions. And then there's the return policy, and this is has two potential use cases. One is just giving you more Fell Hunters and more Blobs of Tar, so you would use it to discover a Fell Hunter, which would then summon two Blobs of Tars, or to actually draw you more of these in case you your Tuskpiercer, like if your first Tuskpiercer Death Rattle just gave you like a Fell Hunter, then this doesn't work yet, and then you can go for the return policy to trigger this and hope for a Blob of Tar. Because you always need to play this first, because it needs to die before the Fell Hunter does anything. That's the first idea behind this deck, that you just set up this wall of blobs and your opponent can't get through, and you can get through your opponent and get also some chip damage in. The second idea, later in the game usually, then is this Cliff Dive, which has been quite commonly included in Demon Hunter decks, at least this year. And the idea of the Cliff Dive is just to cheat out some minions and basically do not have the negative side effect of them going back into your deck at the end of the turn. So there's Magteridon, which you can pull from this, which will stay out. It won't go back because it's dormant. And there's these Inquisitors, and if you attack with your hero, they already attack your opponent as well, or well, whatever target you attacked with your hero. And also, like the Fell Hunters and the Blob of Tar, like if you get them from this, you can sacrifice them from the Cliff Dive. So the strong thing about these cards is also the Death Rattle, especially of the Fell Hunter. Summoning two Blobs of Tar is really good, and if you had one blob die, then from a Cliff Dive you can sacrifice the Fell Hunter and get two more blobs out. And then there's like a couple of, I would say, honorable mentions. So from Cliff Dive, this deck I'm showing right now on screen, it runs Zilliax as well, just to get some heal in, which makes it slightly better against aggro. Although there's not that much aggro right now, at least in like the highest ranks of play. Also has some use cases against more controllish decks if they try to counter pressure you. You could also include the Drake, Briar Spawn Drake, for some additional damage, because if you pull it from Cliff Dive, it will attack before it goes back into the deck. Another card that is somewhat unrelated to these two packages, but is actually very strong as well with both of them, is Caulifero. Here the idea is you quite often have a lot of small minions here with Blob of Tar, and so the remains of the Blob of Tar after your opponent killed it, you get like 2 1/2s, and also like the Dangerous Cliffside. So you quite often have a lot of minions on board, and then small minions, and then if you play Caulifero, you can potentially transform them into very big minions. Like you can get, for example, 6 Inquisitors from that, for a total of 48 damage plus whatever your hero does in one turn. Or you could get like 6 Magteridons. Questionable whether you actually want that, but in some situations maybe you do, and then it deals like 18 damage to all enemies at the end of your turn. Can get a board full of the EXs, stuff like that. The weakness of this deck is actually the early turns, because you don't have anything to fight for board until turn 4 when you play your Blob of Tar, or turn 3 if you have a coin potentially. That's why we also include like some early game stuff to just finish out the deck. This includes Grim Harvest, Infestation. So Grim Harvest doesn't do anything immediately, but at least it gives you something to do with your 2 mana. Infestation is pretty good if you have to fight for the board early on. The Slumber, Wyvern Slumber, that's like an AoE, which can be quite decent, or if your opponent has no minions, you can use it to summon the dormant minions as well. The general game plan of this deck is you play your Blob of Tar, you into the Fell Hunters to resummon them, and then towards the end of or a little bit later, you try and finish off your opponent with either Cliff Dive or Caulifero, if he still lives. Quite often he's already beaten by the Blob of Tar and the Fell Hunters at some point. Elise is a bit of a questionable inclusion into this deck, because it doesn't fit with the theme. Like, it makes your Cliff Dive worse, it makes your Caulifero worse, but it's just such a strong card overall that I think it's the worst to include it. If you can manage to fulfill her requirement. So let's talk a little bit about the mulligan in general, and then have a look at different mulligan situations, opening hands. So what you're looking for goes with our game plan, which is to start with these Blob of Tars. So we're really looking for Tuskpiercer. This is just like your tutor card, which draws you the Blob of Tar and the Fell Hunter. You're looking for the Blob of Tar itself, even though it's a 4 mana card. I think you pretty much always keep it. You keep your Grim Harvest because it's your best 2 mana card, best early game card next to Tuskpiercer. And then there's some potential keeps, notably Elise is usually a keep, I would say, depending on the matchup a little bit. The Wyvern Slumber is your only AoE and your only real 3 mana card. You can use Infestation as a 3 mana card. But usually you want to keep it if you're not on the coin, because your turn 3 is usually your weakest turn in this deck, or it's like the weakest slot, I would say. So you keep it, especially also against aggro, because it's an AoE card. And the same kind of holds for Infestation. That is also like a pretty good keep if you expect to have to fight for the board early. That would be aggro, or maybe something like a Discover Hunter where he has a 1/2 which needs to be removed. Depending a little bit on what else you have in your hand. And finally, you can keep the Ravenous Far Hunter in some situations, because it also increases your chances of getting the Blob of Tar from a Tuskpiercer. So, for example, if you're on the coin, you have Tuskpiercer, Grim Harvest, and Ravenous Far Hunter. You could consider just keeping it because you have the 1 mana card, you have the turn 2 play, which actually it was your another card, and because the Tuskpiercer then more likely pulls the Blob of Tar. And then, yeah, sometimes you might keep Return Policy, usually not. Pretty much everything else you throw away, I would say. Unless you really precisely have a good reason why to keep it in a specific matchup. Okay, here we have our first mulligan, precise mulligan. This is a situation from a game I had. So we're playing this deck. We're actually playing with Briarspawn Drake here. As I said, this is another option instead of Zilliax. Otherwise, it's pretty much exactly the deck I just showed to you. And yeah, like you can play either one. Like they're both very competitive and they're not that different. Of course, there's like a slight change, but they play more or less the same. So if you want to pause the video or like think about this mulligan yourself first, please do so. Otherwise, I'm gonna tell you what I'm thinking about this. So we're also having on the left here like some cheat sheet, but I wouldn't rely on this too much. So here we have one card which I said we pretty much always keep, which is the Blob of Tar, and we also keep it here against the Death Knight. Before maybe going into detail on what cards to keep, maybe it helps you to think about what your opponent does as well. In particular, we have a Death Knight here. It's all control Death Knight, at least at High Legend. It used to be. There's some hand buff Death Knight now as well. But also that's kind of control-ish. So what we would expect here is early game we would expect the 2 1/1s turn 1, and then we would expect a Leech or the 1/2 with Discover on turn 2. Those are like the 2 main plays of Death Knight early on, just so we have this in mind. So we keep the Blob of Tar because we always keep it. We do keep the Wyvern Slumber, I would say. This is a little bit questionable because we are on the coin here. So we could, in principle, think about going coin on turn 3 we could in principle think about going coin, Blob of Tar. That would be fine. So if that's the reason why you would get rid of Wyvern Slumber, then that would be a good reason and a valid reason. And I don't think it's really a mistake to get rid of it. I would generally keep it because I kind of like having the coin in this deck anyway, because later on with like Cliff Dive and stuff like that, you can just play them a turn earlier than you could otherwise. And especially because we are probably against the control matchup here, we don't need to get out the Blob of Tar like immediately turn 3. Return policy I would not keep. That's a pretty high value card. So we already have the Blob of Tar, so we would always want to use a return policy on the Ravenous Fire Hunter. But we don't have the Fire Hunter yet, and this is also much later in the game, so I would kick that out. And Infestation I would keep as well, basically because we don't have a 2 mana play here. And so it just gives us something to do on turn 2, and also because it's pretty good against the leeches. So if you think about it, if your opponent plays the spell, whatever it's called, deal 2 damage and summon a 0/2 leech, then you can use the 2/1 grubs from the Infestation to trade in without actually dying, because it's a 0/2. So I kind of like to keep that here as well. But you don't have to. Like, the statistics here on the left would suggest it's wrong. But I think that is also a little bit misleading, because we already have the Blob of Tar in hand. So we are at much more liberty to keep other cards. If you don't have the Blob, you're much more interested in drawing new cards to hopefully get a Blob or a Tuskpiercer or something. If you do have the Blob, you can keep other cards to fill out your early game, basically. Okay, we have a second situation here. This time we are not on the coin, we are playing against Warlock. So let's start again with like what we expect Warlock to be. I think like there was some aggressive Warlock in the early games of the expansion. At this rank it has pretty much died out by now. Maybe some people are still trying occasionally to do something with it, but I don't think it's good enough. I think the only real Warlock which exists at this rank is Egg Warlock. So they have this Egg of Kalos, which they try to trigger and copy, and then they summon the 2020s. I believe this deck should actually be really good against that, because you have so much poisonous with the Blob of Tar. So you can just deal with the 2020s and then they are losing. Of course you can be overpowered if you don't have the Blob of Tar or something. But this can always happen. So what I would keep here is for sure the Tuskpiercer, because that pulls the other Death Rattle cards which you really want from your deck. Notably the Blob of Tar, but also like the Fire Hunter you probably also want at some point. Caulifero, I pretty much never keep, especially not against the deck where I have to do something before turn 8. And if I'm playing against a deck where I don't have to do something before turn 8, then I hate my life anyway, because that's a boring matchup. So get rid of it here. We have to do something before turn 8 for sure against Warlock. And then the Slumber, you can consider again either keeping it or giving it away. I would be a little bit more tempted to give it away here than in our previous example, because we don't have the Blob of Tar yet, which is really the one card we are actively looking for. We probably don't need the AoE, although it could be aggro in principle. But we are not on the coin, and therefore we don't have a turn 3 anyway. And we have a Tuskpiercer, which is a 50-50 chance of getting a Blob of Tar, in addition to whatever draws we have by turn 4. So I would still keep it here in this situation, but it is an edge case where you can either get rid of it or not. Okay, let's have a look at one more. One more mulligan hand, like explicit example. So here we're playing against Rogue. There's several Rogues at Top Legend. It's probably become the most played class again. There's Psycho Rogue, which is pretty good. There is Protoss Rogue, which, yeah, tries to create these Templars and the Archons and copy them with like the Elise location, stuff like that. And there's like Ferak Rogues still kind of exist. So there's like somewhat different rogue decks out there. So what do we want to keep here? Generally, the Inquisitor is a card you always like mulligan. You never keep it. It's probably the worst thing you can draw. Although in this case it might be the Briarspawn Rake, but it's like, or Magteridon is also really bad. Like they're all four or all three of them. They're 4 cards, but you only have 3 different ones. They're all really bad, and you absolutely do not want them in your hand at any point in the game, usually. Except if they give you lethal, which is why you always get rid of them. The Cliff Dive is probably too early here. I don't love it. It is a key part of the deck, so there is some argument for keeping it, but especially against Rogue, you kind of want to get some chip damage in because they're really bad at healing, and you also have to fight for the board. The X, I don't know. I would not keep it, but I haven't really figured out how to use this Broxigar package at all. I think the basic idea is that it gives you more card draw, so you cycle through your deck a little bit faster. And also it can give you a target for your Briarspawn Drake, and it can of course give you the 12/12 charge. But I have been not too impressed by it, so I can't really tell you a good reason why I would keep the X here. It's also some life gain, right? But you probably don't want to mulligan to get lifesteal. That would be kind of backwards, because you only need the lifesteal if you have a bad early game. The Slumber, I think, is a must keep here, because if it is Psycho Rogue, you kind of need an AoE. And it's a cheap card, so it can be played early game. Even if it's not Psycho Rogue, then you just get the 2 dormant Dread Seeds, that's fine as well. So I would keep it here, even though we have nothing from our package that we actually want, and we also don't have and we are on the coin, so those would be 2 reasons not to keep it. But still, I think against Psycho Rogue, because they make a very wide board, you kind of want any AoE.